let's talk about profiles and permissions and sharing and security, how it all layers together. And this can be a really confusing thing for a lot of people, admins as well. Under which situations should things be readable, writable, updatable, creatable, deletable, all these things. And there's a number of different layers from permissions through sharing rules and org-wide defaults. And I want to go through that and see if I can help you understand the structure and the kind of the layering of how that stuff is computed in Salesforce to determine whether you should have access to something or not. So first of all, we want to think of this as a separation between metadata and data. And in Salesforce, metadata basically means everything except the data, right? So it means code, it means tables, objects, fields, everything, workflow rules, flows, UIs, page layouts, everything. It's everything except for the actual data that's put into the system is called metadata. So let's draw that line first. If we think about an object in Salesforce as a database table, I think it makes it a little bit easier to understand. So first, I want to say, number one is that profiles and permissions equals metadata, or it works with metadata. Whereas sharing rules and org-wide defaults pertain to data. So I want to actually break this down a little bit because one of the easier things to deal with is the parts of the metadata like system settings, who can do what and where. That's all permissions and profiles. So we can just get that right out of the way. Can you run reports? Can you change ownership? Can you do certain things? Can you author Apex code? Can you create page layouts? These are kind of administrative things that profiles and permissions specify. I think the part where these start overlapping and getting confusing for most people is when it comes to records. I go to an account or a contact. How do I know, based on my mix of profiles, permissions, and sharing rules and org-wide defaults, if any type of person should be able to read, access, edit, delete, all of these things? So let's start by looking at what an object looks like as a table and break down the different components. So I'm just going to draw what basically an object is behind the scenes, which is a database table. You could almost think of it as like an Excel spreadsheet. But the columns are very specific. So let's just deal with the account object as an example to start with, okay? So each object would be one of these tables. So we'll just keep the fields somewhat limited here. And we'll go with some of the basics. We have ID, name. Let's do website, number of employees. I think that's fine for now. And so on. And you may have many, many, many more fields, but that's OK. Now, then we're going to have records. The records are the instances of the object, right? So each record is an individual account. So the metadata is a couple of things. So the metadata is the account table itself. The whole thing is a piece of metadata, so the structure of the object, and the fields. Now the other part of the fields is like the data types. So name is a piece of text, website, these are all pieces of text actually, but you may have numbers, you may have dates, you may have lookup fields. You have these different data types. That's all part of the metadata. That's all how we describe metadata. It's the data that describes the data, right? Name is metadata, Acme Co is data. Now the data, let's just is all the stuff that sits inside the container, all the instances. So this, all the stuff that sits in this grid, this is the data. So when we think about the breakup between metadata and data, our profiles and permission state, what's the controls that have been put in place for us on the metadata, where the sharing specifies what can I access inside the cells once I've gotten past that first layer of protection. Let's talk a little bit about the access to all of this stuff. So there's something called CRUD, or sometimes it's called CRED, depends on where you're looking, but this stands for create, read, update, and delete. The reason why we have an E sometimes is sometimes we call this edit. So you might see it as CRUD, you might see it as CRED, but it's create, read, update, delete, or create, read, edit, delete. That initial criteria is controlled by the profiles and permissions, okay? They declare, can someone create accounts, read accounts, update accounts, or delete accounts? As a whole, as an object. It doesn't get into the individual account records. It says, what is the high level you can do with accounts? What is your general permissions to this object? Okay? And this is at the whole object level. This doesn't get into fields yet. That would be field level permissions, which we'll get into in a bit. So this is from what the profile is going to tell you, and or permissions, which are really made up of the same stuff. So you can see it applies to all of the object, but it doesn't give you the data level. Once I can, say, read an account, I now have to ask, well, which accounts? That's where sharing and org-wide defaults come into place. What Salesforce is going to do when I try to access an account record, it's going to say, can Ari first read accounts? Because that's the minimum for me to see something on screen. I have to have read access to it. But then it says, yeah, but he's trying to access Acme Corp, right? And based on certain sharing or org-wide default rules, I may not have access to that specific account. So just because permissions tells me I can read accounts doesn't mean I can read all accounts. And the org-wide defaults are going to, at least for these standard objects, boil down to some pretty basic stuff. And we'll talk about some of the basics. This would be an org-wide default. We would have something called private. That means I can see all accounts which I own. If they're public, that means I can see all accounts regardless. In fact, it means everybody can, as long as they have read permissions. Now, if you don't have any CRUD, if you don't have any CRED to account, the sharing doesn't matter. You just don't have access to accounts. So you don't even have to go down that questioning line. So when this actually saves us on performance. So if Salesforce determines that, you know what, this person doesn't even have access to accounts, no CRED, no read access to accounts, it doesn't have to go down these additional computations of, well, what about this account that he's trying to access right now? So that just saves us a whole lot of computing time, as a lot of these things are kind of calculated on the fly. Let's take a look at how these different things work together to do this job of figuring out who can do what at the time of accessing a piece of data. So I'm going to clear this for a moment. So I usually do it with these 4 squares. This is just the way I kind of visualize it very often. We have profiles, and we have sharing rules. Okay. Now, I draw it this way for a reason, because the columns and the rows have meaning to each other. When we split things this way, we're talking about the split, obviously, between the metadata controls and the data controls. When we split things this way, it's actually a different, it's another split. It's basically taking baselines and additions to the baseline is what these bottoms are for. So profiles and permission sets. Every user in Salesforce has to have a profile, okay? And an example of a profile would be like system admin, standard user. These are the ones that come out of the box. You may be creating your own profiles, but when you look at a profile, you'll just see, miles of checkboxes of these different permissions. So a profile, it's really just made up of all these different permissions, right? And you're going to have your create, read, update, delete permissions for every single object in the system that you have to specify. Furthermore, you're also going to have read and update permissions for every single field of every single object, and that gets down into field level security. Now, permission sets add to your profile. So in Salesforce, everything's additive. So if I say, if my profile says I cannot access accounts, but I have a permission set that says I can, it means that I can. So permission sets only add to your profile. I can't have a permission set that says actually under certain circumstances, you don't. That doesn't exist. Which is why when we build these things, we make our baseline stuff that as restricted as possible because we know we're only going to add to them. So what's the point of a permission set? Why not just make those changes in the profile itself? Well, sometimes you have people in maybe some kind of horizontal role versus maybe your typical vertical hierarchies within your organization that need special permissions on a one-off basis. Everything in their profile is the same. There's 30 people with this profile, except this one person, or maybe across some different profiles needs, let's say, view encrypted data access because they have to perform some special function within the organization. And so we create a permission set that allows that permission, and we hand it out to those individuals. And that's using permission set assignments. I'm not going to deep dive into permission set assignments, but basically once you create a permission set, you can give it to anybody you want regardless of their profile. It simply adds to their profile. So permission sets are ways to extend profiles. They're much more granular. In fact, as we get more sophisticated with our Salesforce environments, I actually think we're going to be seeing more and more things controlled by permission sets with very, very basic profiles for even better control, especially with DevOps and packaging and things like that. So permission sets extend profiles. Now it's the same thing here. Org-wide default. There's a default per object. You're going to have something like a private or a public default. Now there are things like controlled by parent, there's grant access using hierarchies, there's some other little things you can tune with these, but for the most part you're looking at private, public, controlled by parent, and this is the default for the object. So if there's anybody or set of people in the organization that should not have access to something, or should have private access to it, they should only see the stuff that they own, the org-wide default has to be private because you're going to take it down to its minimum, to its most restrictive version. The most restrictive version has the default, and what you're going to do is open up sharing to others based on conditions. So even if there's only 2 people in your 100-person organization that need to be private, the default is now private because the default is the most restrictive. Even though it might be nice to say, hey, keep it public for everybody except these people, that's just not how it works. It's a purely additive model. So it does have, the downside of not being able to cater to the most popular situation, but it also makes sharing very predictable, right? If you're used to other types of infrastructure, maybe like AWS or Azure or something like that, you'll know that you can actually create very, very complex security groups, things like that. The rules there can almost contradict themselves, and there's a very special way in which you have to calculate them. You can have a rule that says you can, and then another rule that says you can't, but based on where it sits is what kind of wins the argument. In Salesforce, it's really easy. You start strict and you expand from there. So a sharing rule is something you can add to an org-wide default. This isn't handed out to individuals quite like a permission set, but it works in the same way in that it's additive. And a sharing rule might say, under certain conditions, certain people can see certain records. The sharing rules open up sharing beyond what the org-wide default says. And sharing rules can leverage things like roles and public groups in order to open that up. So it's not on a user-by-user basis. It doesn't have to be. But you can basically say, well, if a certain field has a certain value even on the record, then extend sharing to the following people. If there's something that says even a checkbox or a text field has a certain value, that can trigger a sharing rule and say, well, then include these people. Now, when you're building a sharing rule, they're also going to talk about things like, well, read and write and things like that, things that we typically think of as permissions. If some criteria is met, allow Jason to now read and edit accounts, this account where this condition is true. But what if Jason doesn't have account edit on his profile or permissions? Then it doesn't matter what the sharing rule says. The sharing rule can only go as far as your permission. And that's a really critical thing here, because when you're troubleshooting this, you might say, I don't understand why he can't edit these records. The sharing rule specifically extends access to editing. The problem is Jason doesn't have the key to edit. Permissions are you need it's like launching a nuke, right? You need two keys. You need the key from sharing and you need the key from here. Now, a typical sharing doesn't ask these questions about read and edit. It just says, can you access the record or can't you based on some rule? The profile determines this. But what this does is says, well, you know what? Jason typically can't see the Acme Corp account, but we're going to say, based on some criteria, we want to make Jason to be able to see the Acme Corp account. We want to allow that to happen. But do we want him to be able to edit that account? Let's say he does have edit access. You say, no, just let him read it. And that's okay, because we're just cracking the door open. Jason can edit all accounts that he has access to. This one doesn't typically have access to. The sharing rule says now you can read it, but we're not fully allowing edit. He can edit all things that he has full edit access to. So you kind of have to have it in both worlds here. Now, org-wide defaults don't get down into that nuance as much as sharing rules. So you have to have both. Now, because sharing can get really, really comprehensive, there are more things to open up sharing beyond just these two. Profiles and permissions are a lot more canned because the metadata doesn't grow the same way data does. You can have records upon records upon records. The metadata is more fixed. Of course, you're adding to the metadata potentially all the time as you develop your org. Sharing can be extended in a number of other ways too, through things like account teams. We have opportunity teams. I'll call these op teams. We have case teams. We have record shares. These are like individual record shares. So we have all these other ways to extend sharing. And you could think of sharing more similar to how you would do in a document environment if you're used to like Google Docs or something. And you click share, you're basically adding somebody to the access control list. You're saying, give that person access. Now, I can give a person access all day. Remember, they have to have at least permissions to that object in the first place. If they're given access by any of these measures, and they don't have a profile or permission set saying they have access to this object at all, this won't matter. This is just sharing. This is not permissions, okay? And so the more things you do here, potentially the less performant something is, because Salesforce, when you're looking at a record or you're querying something, you're searching for something, Salesforce has to first say, wait a second, stop here. Do they have access? Okay. Now, when I start typing in Acme to the search bar, or I'm running a report where Acme may come up based on the filter criteria, it has to say, well, who's running this report? Who's typing in this search? It says, okay, the org-wide default, nope, that doesn't say they can access it. That's private and they're not the owner. The sharing rules don't say they can access it. Are they on one of the account teams for Acme Corp that says they can access it? So it's going to go through all of this until it exhausts it. So obviously, if you're not using any of these, it doesn't have to go through them. The sooner it hits something, the easier it is. So because of that, there are some shortcuts that we have in the permission side of the house to make certain operations like this a little more performant. It's kind of a way to jump over sharing from the profile side of the house, just to add confusion. So profiles have this 2 extra things beyond the regular set of 4 over here, and it's view all and modify all. And you'll see these are kind of behind a line, but they do go in order here. And view all and modify all are really performance tricks. So instead of saying, yeah, I can create, I can read, I can update, I can delete, you could have all 4 of these but not have view all or modify all. And what view all and modify all state, if I do have them, is that ignore sharing. I don't care what sharing says. Private, it doesn't matter if they're private, I can view all. It doesn't matter if I'm the owner or not. I can view all, or they can view all, they can modify all. So a specific person with a specific profile does not have to obey sharing, then why create this whole mess of sharing rules just for them? Why not just do view all, modify all? Then Salesforce can say, oh, they have view all. I don't have to ask sharing any questions at all about this any further. It creates a much faster load time. It's a lot more performant. Salesforce computers don't have to work as hard to go through all these different things. They're basically done once they cross one of these off. So you can skip all the sharing questions. This doesn't mean for all fields, though. So remember our table, we have our fields. So each field has its own field level security as well. And field level security is 2 options. Either you can read or you can write. Read, write. You don't delete fields. You can remove the value from a field. You're not deleting the field itself, though. Whereas a record, you could delete the whole record. You're not deleting a field. So you're either going to read, you can either look at fields or you can write to fields. That's deep within profiles and permissions as well. It's called field level security, and it specifies your read-write access to every single field. And that is not accounted for in view all and modify all. And sharing never extends access to fields. That is fully controlled by the metadata side of the house with profiles and permissions. Again, view all, modify all does not overwrite your field level permissions. So it just is a sharing shortcut. You still have to have edit access to the fields. Now it's kind of strange. One thing you might encounter, hopefully you don't encounter this is not a good configuration, but be on the lookout for what if you do have edit access to an object, but for some reason you can't seem to edit anything? Well, what if you could have read-only access to every single field on that object. So it doesn't matter that you can edit the object as a whole. There's not a single field you can edit. So you have edit access to the object, but not any of its fields. So technically, you're not going to be able to edit anything in the end of the day. So it doesn't matter. But these are all these little nuances to look for. These controls have to be in place at these different levels to really create the environment that you want. And you always want to look at keep it simple, keep it very basic from the baseline stuff, the profiles, the org-wide defaults. Keep permissions tight, least privilege access, and extend from there based on the situations, based on the requirements. Maybe you have most accounts are private, but you have some kind of generic vendor list or something that everybody has access to. Create a sharing rule that extends access when record type equals vendor, something like that. And that will help you really keep everything in check. It's also good to go through and clean these up once in a while. Salesforce makes it a little too easy probably when you're creating new fields to just kind of click next through things where it kind of by default gives everybody access to every field that you create. So just be careful when you do stuff like that. And there's definitely a lot more to potentially explore here. We could do some stuff on screen next time. Let me know if you have any questions, and we can do a deeper dive into why you're seeing what you see, why users are experiencing what they experienced based on your profiles and sharing setups.